So guilt I think of as being a motivating emotion, a motivating experience, whereas shame is the complete opposite of that. Shame just destroys motivation. It destroys any kind of forward momentum or forward motion.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, you're going to hear another clip from an interview I did with Renee Swanson, a certified life coach and the host of the Covert Narcissism podcast. With over a decade of experience, she helps survivors break free from emotional abuse, rebuild confidence, and reclaim their lives. What I really appreciate about Renee is how naturally she brings passion and insight together. Her presence is both steadying and deeply human, and that really comes through in this conversation. One of the topics we explored together was guilt. What is it? Where does it come from? And how it functions in contrast to shame. Guilt can feel heavy, but healthy as compared to toxic or pathological guilt. Healthy guilt signals growth. It means someone else has entered your emotional world, not as a threat to your self-image, but as a person whose pain matters to you. But here's the thing, the ability to feel guilt has everything to do with how we were met as children and how we were treated. Were our caregivers able to handle our anger without collapsing or shaming us? Could they stay connected even when we messed up? In this segment, Renee and I talk about how guilt is born out of early relational experiences and why, when it shows up in adulthood, it may actually be a sign of emotional maturity, not weakness. Let's get right into it. I hope this conversation resonates with you and brings a fresh perspective and a sense of hope.
So looking at the other side of this, what is guilt?
So remember, the first place we started with shame was that it starts very early in life. And I'd love to hear your theory on guilt as well as we get into that, Renee. But guilt starts a little bit later. And the research shows this too. So from a psychodynamic lens, guilt arises from a conflict between internalized values. So that's good. So you're internalizing the values. This is what we call in my field, like the superego, like the sort of part of your brain or your mind that looks over to see if you're meeting certain morals and values and expectations. But there's a conflict, right? And that's why there's guilt. So you have internalized something good, morals and values. And then there's a conflict with one's own wishes, actions, thoughts, or behaviors, right? So you're not being exposed. It's not like your sense of self is so worthless, but it's that you're violating your own internal standard, which is good because now you have an internal standard, you see? Or here's the second definition of it, and we could zoom in on these as we go along. So that's the first one is you're violating some inner standard. And the second one is you're causing harm to somebody that you care about. So guilt says, I did something wrong, and I care about the impact of my action and what it did to you, Renee, let's say in this example, right? Or a man lashes out against his wife, and he says things that are intentionally hurtful, let's say, right? But when he steps back and he reflects on it, he says that I hurt my wife, and this is somebody that I love, and I care about them, and this is not a good feeling. So then what I need to do, and he'll have a conflict because I'm so angry at her because of the way she did this, but I love her and she didn't deserve this kind of treatment. So guilt emerges then from seeing that conflict and then wanting to what we could call repair the damage that you've created. So that's sort of a few different ways to look at guilt. And I'm curious to hear how you think of it or if this sounds familiar to you at all.
Very much so. I think of guilt as, unlike shame, I think of guilt as being a feeling that is driving feeling that motivates us to repair, fix, restore, any of those kind of, that direction. Whereas shame, like we talked about earlier, becomes more of an experience and more of an identity based. I don't think of guilt as being that. Guilt is more tied to our actions or our behaviors or even the thoughts we have, but it is then inside we are assessing whether we believe that what we did was right or wrong.
Yes.
We're not assessing whether I'm a good or bad person. I'm not assessing my identity, but I'm assessing that action, that behavior. Was it right or wrong?
So now we need to go one step further. This is what differentiates it from shame, because shame, like you could say, I did something wrong, but then what do you do with that? You see, that's the critical piece of guilt as well, because guilt is tied to empathy, and that's the ability to manage somebody else's pain. And like I mentioned, and you're saying, the desire to repair it. So that's really, so you have to not just apologize, because plenty of people with these narcissistic traits they have no problem apologizing, but nothing changes.
Right.
So it's not just the apology, it's the acknowledgement that he hurt you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in this example, he hurt his wife, right? And then that he's taking the steps to either say, you know what, you're right. You mentioned that I tend to become quite angry and belligerent when I'm drinking. I think I need to deal with my drinking. Or maybe I need to deal with my aggressive behavior and I need to talk to somebody. See, now that's a reparative effort. It's not just saying I'm sorry and this won't happen again. That's not enough. That's healthy guilt, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It goes
Yes.
a little bit further than that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a developmental achievement and it happens later, just so you know, than shame, because now you're able to recognize the other person as separate from you, which many people with these narcissistic characteristics who have shame and narcissism are like, they go hand in hand, as we mentioned earlier. But when there's shame and narcissism, there's no other. There's no separate other. You feel like your sense of worth has collapsed. That has nothing to do with somebody else.
Right.
Or repairing the fact that you hurt them. Yeah, go ahead.
Right.
Please.
And you don't know how to repair. Like people who are trapped in that, it's like they can't get to the next stage, okay, of emotional growth, emotional development, emotional maturity. And like what you're saying, guilt definitely, often at least, motivates towards repair. Okay,
Yes.
Healthy guilt. Healthy guilt will motivate you towards not just apologies, like you said, but change behavior and growth. So guilt, I think of as being a motivating emotion, a motivating experience, whereas shame is the complete opposite of that. Shame just destroys motivation. It destroys any kind of forward momentum or forward motion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing you become motivated for, if I could think of one, is it's all about you with shame, you see? It's like a regression back into the self. So you could start beating yourself up and then maybe somebody will come and rescue you. But the point is, it's no longer organized. Like guilt is organized around somebody else as a separate person with their own feelings. And you're right, shame is just about you and not growth promoting, because having and repairing a relationship, that's a sign of growth.
Absolutely.
For sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. So where does guilt originate? We talked about where shame originates from. Where does guilt originate?
So it's actually, since it starts a little bit later, it's, again, in the research, it's thought to start like maybe around age 5 or 6. And that still seems pretty early, but there's really good research out there to show that even at that early age, that the child is beginning to internalize values and morals of the family. And more importantly, they're beginning to understand and have a capacity for concern. So like if you look at, any kind of play therapy, for example, with kids, their behaviors will begin to indicate that they're experiencing guilt, even at that early age. So what does that look like? So if they destroy something in play, you may see them trying to repair it, right? If they do something that they know hurts somebody else, like they stole a toy, they may actually have the capacity to apologize for it. So in other words, in short, they're developing empathy, which is necessary for guilt. And they're beginning to see the other person as separate and what we call whole. And I won't go down this too much because this is a little bit of too much theory, but basically the difference between shame and guilt is part-object relations. In other words, in part-object relations, that's shame. Somebody's there just to meet your needs. And if they don't meet your needs, you have every right to be furious with them, right? Or to shame them or humiliate them. Why? Because they deserve it, okay?
Right.
So then with guilt, we think of it as relating to whole objects. That just means another person, but that means that they're not just there to meet your needs anymore, that they have thoughts, feelings of their own that could be different than yours. And that's very painful, but it doesn't give you the right to destroy what they believe or feel.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of what you're expressing here is the development of the ability to recognize another person's feelings, but also their boundaries. That there are boundaries that are in place for that person. So when it's a shame-based thinking, you have hurt me, therefore now it's my get out of jail free card. I can treat you however I please. Okay. Yeah. But when it's guilt-based and you have hurt me, there are still boundaries in place. Even though you have hurt me, I am still taking care of, making sure that this repair happens with your feelings and your boundaries being cared for too.
Right. And when you say boundaries, I think this is what you mean, but let me just check. The boundary is between self and other. In other words, there's another person. It's not a merged, or to use your word from earlier, like enmeshed or codependent relationship. So a boundary doesn't mean I'm holding you at a distance, but it's that I respect where I end and you begin.
Absolutely.
So there were two people in the relationship instead of just one.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
I've got an analogy that I use a lot. If you draw a circle inside a circle, so it looks like an egg and a yolk. And a child growing up, that yolk is the child's identity is completely consumed in the parent's identity. Okay. Any child, they go where mom and dad go. They like what they like. They do the things that they do. And then as they form into their own person, the two circles start to separate. So now we have like a Venn diagram where you've got two circles that overlap some.
Yes.
And you've got this identity and the parent's identity and the child, so maybe a teenager's identity, there's still some overlap. And then as we come into healthy adulthood, we have two circles, and that being each other's identities. And those are the boundaries that you get to exist, like what you said, is yourself. I recognize where I stop and you start. Okay, those are the boundaries that are separated. When we get enmeshed back into a narcissistic relationship, a marriage, in a narcissistic relationship, it's like that process reverses. It becomes a little bit enmeshed, and ultimately you become, again, the egg and the yolk, and your entire identity is enmeshed within that narcissistic person.
Yeah.
And so that is what I'm referring to with boundaries, is knowing where I start and stop and where others start and stop.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when you get into adulthood, I would just visualize it slightly differently. So instead of two separate sort of boundary, whatever the, separate circle, a sign of healthy development would be that there's a togetherness that does overlap at times, and then a separateness, and that you feel it's a fluidity, in other words, that you feel comfortable enough merging at certain moments. Think about sexual intimacy, right? How intense that could get, or feeling deep empathy for somebody. So you don't want to be too separate. You want to have the fluidity where you could step in, but more importantly, unlike the earlier when you said you regress, but to be able to step out. And that's really part of therapy too. The deep sort of psychoanalytic work, or psychodynamic work that I do, it's never that like completely separate image that you described in adulthood. As a good therapist, you have to be able to step in. And I talk about this quite a bit in my podcast, and people really have strong feelings about it, in terms of when you're working with a narcissist. An example I use quite a bit is the vulnerable narcissist who's living at home and is living like a parasitic life, living off of his parents. And I always emphasize containment and helping the child, not creating a boundary or kicking him or her out. I mean, at some point you may have to do that if they just become too abusive, but initially containing, stepping in, holding, and people really object to that. And part, like you said, Renee, I think in that image is like, we feel like we need to be so separate from these people, but a sign of health is to be able to step in and step out. So that's the only
absolutely.
That,
and back in that analogy, and I didn't talk through all of it here, but I do talk about how that in between, up here, you've got two separate circles, down here, you have the egg and the yolk. In between is this overlap that it fluctuates.
Yeah, that's
sometimes
important.
It's going to overlap more than others. Sometimes you feel more connected and other times you don't.
Yeah.
But that's a healthy space.
And by the way, in case anyone's wondering, so how does guilt develop? I mentioned at the age it develops, internalizing morals and values. But this is actually the most important piece of guilt, is that you have a parent that when you do something, excuse my language, stupid, which kids do, they're not made to feel stupid. That's the main thing, is that you could sit down and put your arm on them and say, listen, you knocked down little Susie's blocks. Like, what was going on? Or you can't be, it's understandable. I appreciate that you got angry with Susie. We all get angry, but you can't knock down her block. So you're doing it in sort of a firm way, but you're stepping into their world, down at their level, maybe your hand on their shoulder. That's kind of the merging, or that fluidity that I just mentioned. Because as a parent, of course, you're going to have your own feelings if your child is behaving aggressively. Who knows what they may be, but if you have your own guilt or superego internalized moral or shame, exactly, and that's the other side. Because most parents, believe it or not, well, I don't want to say most, because of the adults that I work with, of course, I have a biased sample because they're in therapy, but they shame the kid. That's right. They say, what's wrong with you? Like, you always mess everything up, and that's the kind of reaction that, of course, will lead to shame instead of guilt.
Of course. And it will lead then to defensive behaviors coming from that child. Because
you have no choice, right? That goes back to what we said before. That's adaptive. And they're automatic. They're not even thought of. And then in comes all the defenses that go along with shame, which is the splitting and the projection and making other people feel just as humiliated as you once felt, but you don't want to feel again. Right. Yeah.
When you go down a path as a child feeling unsafe, this is where I come back to it being a threat response. You lose your emotional safety when you're being told by your parent, the one that you've put on the pedestal, that you're being told, what's wrong with you? Why can't you ever do anything right? And so you're being told that you're bad and you're unworthy and all of this. That is a threat to you emotionally, but it's also a threat to your own identity.
Yes.
And so you have to reestablish a sense of safety somehow. And in order to reestablish that sense of safety, then is where children turn to the defensive behaviors we mentioned, such as splitting, like you've mentioned, and projecting, and the people pleasing. Like, I'm just going to kick it into people pleasing mode, and I'll do everything to keep that parent happy. That way I can feel worthy again. And so it's a sense of trying to reestablish safety.
Yep. And it's sad because you mentioned it affects your identity, and that's exactly right. And one of the definitions of a personality disorder, object relation school call it identity diffusion. In other words, you don't know what your identity is because from this early age, you're engaging in these really early defenses, like we call them primitive defenses, not in a pejorative way, but that they start really early before you could begin to establish your identity. So you don't know who you are, where guilt, to go back just to comparing the two, since it starts later and you internalize, remember that's where I started with morals and values, you already have a sense of identity. It's establishing or getting established. Let's put it that way. It's not consolidated. Yeah, it consolidates later on, adolescence, where you have another opportunity at this. That's why I mentioned a teacher or a coach, because you really do get another opportunity at internalizing a good object. I always go back into the sort of psychoanalytic language. A good person, right? A coach, a supportive one who's going to sit down and maybe not shame you, because that's sort of a critical moment. Because what happens if you get that shaming response, like, what's wrong with you? Now you don't have guilt. You at best would have what we call toxic guilt, which is bordering on shame because it's part of your identity now. Yeah.
Well, that leads us right into the next question, which is, we've talked a couple of times about healthy guilt. We've used that phrase a few times, and now you're bringing in, this toxic guilt or pathological guilt. What's the difference? How do we distinguish that difference?
If this part of the conversation resonated with you and you want to hear more about Renee's next question, which she was just about to ask me, or if you want to hear the full interview, you can head over to her video channel. I'll include the link in the show notes below. Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoy these few clips on shame and guilt. As always, thank you for listening and take good care of yourselves. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.